Good evening, everybody. Welcome again to the Journey Museum and Learning Center's latest evolution in educational programming, that is the Journey Discussions. And I'm Troy Kilpatrick, the Executive Director here, and I'm so happy to be able to host you some way in this crazy year of 2020. Many of you are members and have joined us before at Turtle Soups and learning forums and other events that we may have hosted at the museum. I think we had probably close to 70 different educational programs in 2019 as an example. And I hope you can appreciate the fact that we are going to just continue to persevere through all of these things and do this in a safe way. And this way, you're going to be able to still learn great things about our local history, and we'll create some knowledge around some of these topics. Tonight's program has truly been one that, it got caught in the midst of all of everything that was happening. I mean, 100 years to the 19th Amendment being passed, we've passed some significant dates throughout the course of the year here. But Dr. Molly Rozum, who's joining us tonight, she's been really hanging with us, or I've been hanging with her, I guess. We've been trading emails throughout the summer. I think when I originally introduced myself, I said, Molly, we usually have about 65 people come into the theater, come sit in the gallery. It's a great place to host a program. And that idea kind of went away as we figured out that we couldn't put 65 people in the theater anymore. And we said, well, maybe we could broadcast it and have some people in the audience. We tried some of those that seemed to be, it was really difficult. It wasn't quite working as effective as we had hoped. And I said, well, here's what we're going to do. We're just going to broadcast the program. So Molly is actually joining us from Vermillion, South Dakota, Central Standard Time there, a little after 7 o'clock. And so I want to, we want to thank her. And, if everybody was sitting in front of me right now, to give her a round of applause for joining us. We've got a natural here. We've got a teacher who's been using Zoom. So if you're going to test trying to have a speaker across the state while I'm at the Journey Museum, this is the way to do it and go this direction. Everybody, please mark your calendar. 2 weeks from now at 6 o'clock, Tally Montoneau, who is on our education team, is going to take you into space. She's going to do our Journey into Space program, which is a UniView program. There's images from NASA that are imported in. We did an upgrade to this program, ironically, and again, these are the fun stories of 2020. That upgrade was done the week that we closed. And so not many of you have had the opportunity to see the new program. And there's new graphics or new images of the sun itself and many of the moons that are orbiting around planets throughout the solar system. Again, the images are gathered by NASA satellites. And so Tally's going to fly us through the universe here two Thursdays from now. That's the 17th of December, and that'll be our last Journey discussion for 2020. But we'll be announcing a very large lineup beginning in January through, hopefully we'll have programs all the way through April that we're planning. And then we know that we can pull these off, and they're not contingent on, well, gee, what's happening in the community today? Should we open the museum up and try to have 70 people show up, or should we stay closed? We're just planning to have them online so you guys can mark your calendars for Thursday nights at 6. You should miss that. If it's a conflict for you, you can find these programs in the Journey's video archive at journeymuseum.org. Some of you are probably already familiar with that. We've posted our turtle stories that we did during the early days of the pandemic itself, and all of our education videos that we've continued to create and push out to you, to all of you and your families that you can share with folks. That stuff is all there free. Please share it. We want as many people to see those efforts as possible. It's really our way to continue to be an educational entity in our community, is by us continuing to provide these education programs. And you guys watching and listening and sharing the content is hugely important to us. So thank you for your support as we persevere through all of these things. So enough commercial there about the journey. Let's talk about Dr. Molly Rozum. And again, thank her for joining us tonight. Molly was born in Mitchell, South Dakota, which makes her a colonel, I think, officially, right?
It does.
She's a Mitchell colonel. She grew up from there and went to the University of Notre Dame to get her BA, her Bachelor of Arts. And, so Notre Dame, we have Fighting Irish now. So we have a colonel Fighting Irish. And she went on to get her PhD at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. You got to add Tar Heel in on that now, okay? So from there, she went to Doane College in Crete, Nebraska. I'm sorry, I do not know the nickname of Doane College, Molly. Do they have teams at Doane?
Tigers,
the Doane Tigers. Okay.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
All right. So we got Tigers, Tar Heels, Fighting Irish, and Colonels. All right. So Dr. Rozum is quite accomplished. She's a co-editor, and this is important that I get this in, co-editor for Equality at the Ballot Box, Votes for Women on the Northern Great Plains. It was published in 2019 by the South Dakota Historical Society Press, so it should be pretty available to you. And we have positioned it appropriately so that you can all find it. It's available, I'll bet, online so that you can buy it there and get it shipped to your home. It makes a great Christmas gift as we look back on 100 years here since the 19th Amendment. Molly also has a new book coming out entitled Grasslands Grown, Creating Place on the U.S. Northern Plains and Canadian Prairies. It's due out from the University of Nebraska Press in the summer of 2021 when everything will be normal again, I hope. Please, let's, I'm leaving out the most important part. I'm leaving out all the USD stuff. Journey Museum and Learning Center. Dr. Rozum, Dr. Hackemer, we've got a pipeline for those of you who know the museum team. Corey Christensen graduated from the University of South Dakota. You've seen Corey do a lot of programs. She's got some turtle stories out there. She did the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic that's available online with Dr. Shankar Kura that we did 2 weeks ago. She's a graduate from the University of South Dakota. Casey Sullivan, who was an intern and worked with us and is currently the executive director for the Keystone Museum, and Catherine Zimmer, who's also was an intern. So we've literally got this USD pipeline. And prior to us going live here, I was already putting the arm on Dr. Rozum for, we're going to have more interns, right? Because we have some important work to do with the 1972 Black Hills flood. 50 years is coming in 2022, and you can be assured the Journey Museum and Learning Center is going to be all in and making sure that we commemorate that in the most appropriate fashion, remembering the lives that are lost and talking about the great stories of the comeback in the community too, because it's not just a disaster story, it's also a story of how the community rose back up again, and we want to make sure we get all of that told in the best way possible. Dr. Rozum is also the Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies. She's also the Ronald R. Nelson Chair of Great Plains and South Dakota History from the University of South Dakota, broadcasting live from Vermilion. Please welcome Dr. Molly Rozum.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and we enjoy the relationship the departments build up with the museum through our interns. It provides our interns with a great experience, a lot of knowledge that goes along with their book learning, a lot of practical, here's how you do it in the real world. So we're excited about that relationship. Well, thanks for tuning in, everyone. And I'm happy to be here presenting on South Dakota and women's suffrage. I'm going to share a screen here. I have some slides. I think you will still be able to see me in the corner in a small box once I get this share screen going. And I believe that there's a chat function or a question and answer for you to put if you have thoughts as we go along, and then the questions will be asked at the end of the program. Okay, so this is just a opening slide here that is one I like to show. Of course, there's the image of equality at the ballot box that I worked on with my friend Lori Ann Lallam. She's at University of Minnesota, Mankato. And this book actually has a lot of new articles on women's suffrage in South Dakota, but also Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota, yeah. And so it tells their stories of how suffrage was passed in these states, and then also how these states came to ratify the 19th Amendment, which I'll say a little bit about later. And then I love this image here about that projects where South Dakota was in 1914. You see there, she's painting on the 1914 in the Nevada state. And that year, Nevada won suffrage and Montana did too. And South Dakota and North Dakota both voted on women's suffrage, but it failed in our state. Although you see the kind of hash marks, the diagonal lines, that means that our states had some suffrage rights, which women called partial rights, partial suffrage rights. In our case, in both North Dakota and South Dakota, we could vote in school elections and on school issues. And you see the black, of course, is where they do not have any suffrage rights. And so we see it entrenched in the East and in the South. I'm going to spend a lot of the time today talking about the last campaigns, but I just thought I'd remind you a little bit of how long South Dakotans talked about women's suffrage. For 50 years, from 1868 to even over 50 years, but 1918 is when South Dakota on the state level granted women the right to vote. There were several territorial attempts to grant women voting rights. We had 3 constitutional conventions in the 1880s, and women would testify at those and send letters to the delegates trying to get trying to have South Dakota become the first state to grant women the vote. It did not work out, but they tried. And then there's 6 full statehood campaigns for that. 6 times South Dakota's men vote on women's suffrage. And this is just a quick peek at it. And you see, so over the years, it seems that the state is always talking about suffrage. Women's suffrage is a part of our political culture, you might say. There was even a campaign to expand school suffrage rights. And I put up on here, I thought you'd like to see how Pennington County did in those elections. If you just give that a quick glance, you see that Pennington County was often a supporter. And this is another question that South Dakota historians have is it seemed that the West River counties voted for women's suffrage before East River. Frequently, this is the case. And you can see Pennington did many times. A lot of times, I'm sure many of you may have heard about Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She's one of the early suffragists, and probably the first formal time women asked for the vote was at a meeting called at Seneca Falls, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton, these are 2 pictures of her. We kind of remember her as the older woman, I think, if you know her at all, but she was a young, lively woman during a lot of this campaigning and had 5 or 6 or 7 children too while she was doing all this. But she wrote a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, which, if you catch the meaning, is modeled after the Declaration of Independence. It starts out, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal." If you knew the Declaration of Independence, you would know very quickly that she inserted the word woman there. And basically, in this document, women ask for the right to vote. They ask for what they call the franchise, and they asked for various other legal rights, rights to property, rights to children, rights to divorce, rights to go to college. That's meaningful for me as I became a college teacher and watched all these young women come to college. She, as a young girl, she had several brothers who could go off to college and she could not. She remembers, women coming to her father, who was a lawyer, and he, and with property problems and husband problems. And she, was a very bright young woman. And one of the lines her father said to her once that she that always stuck with her was he looked at her, he said, I wish you were a boy. But this, I want to emphasize, was they did it on the basis of sort of human rights, natural rights, saying, reflecting those Revolutionary era principles that every person, every human being has equal rights. In other words, it shouldn't be divided by gender. Another early woman, or a woman that we associate with the movement generally, is Susan B. Anthony. And about the time Susan B. Anthony comes out to South Dakota, it's about 1890, the new organization, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, is formed, and both Anthony and Stanton head that up. They became friends through anti-slavery work before the Civil War. And in some ways, Anthony was the legs of the movement. She went everywhere. She went all over the United States, where Stanton wrote a lot of the speeches, honed a lot of the ideas they used to convince women to and men to support suffrage. And she came to South Dakota twice. Our first major campaign was the year after statehood. So it started, South Dakota came in as a state on November 2nd, 1889. And women organized an Equal Suffrage Association that October, even before the statehood was formalized. And Anthony came twice to tour the state, and she toured everywhere. She was at, Sioux Falls, Redfield, Huron, Mitchell, Madison, Brookings, DeSmet, Watertown, Parker, Pierre, St. Lawrence, Aberdeen. And I know she spoke in Vermilion too. This is actually a picture of East Hall, where my office is on the campus of University of South Dakota. But that little red star is my office. But one of the funny things I found, I long worked with the Pickler family papers, but reading them anew for this project, I saw that Lulu Pickler, who grew up in Faulkton, South Dakota, her mother was Alice Pickler, a famous suffragist. She writes home to her mother and she says, on my way to the hotel in the evening, I saw someone crossing over one of the streets whom I knew. And who do you think it was? No less personage than Miss Susan B. Anthony. I spoke to her and told her who I was. She remembered me and said that she had a nice time with you. She lectures here next week. And she was doing this, writing a letter from her bedroom in East Hall, where I now have my office. And I always wonder, okay, do I have her old bedroom? Because East Hall used to be a women's dormitory back at that moment. And we know that she went and spoke at the Madison Opera House. Madison formed an Equal Suffrage Association on the town level and had a very supportive weekly newspaper. And it was while she was there that she heard that the US Congress was going to approve statehood for Wyoming, which came in as a state in 1890. And she heard that the US Congress was going to approve it as a state and as a suffrage state. So Wyoming came in as a woman suffrage state in 1890. South Dakota had hoped to do that in 1889, but it did not end up happening. And in fact, South Dakota lost in a major way. You see Pennington County had about 10 more points on the rest of the state's population overall. It's the worst showing South Dakota had in all of its 6 votes for women's suffrage. But they marched on and kept going. I'm going to jump now up to the more modern period as we get to the teens. This is Mary Mamie Shields Pyle. She became president of the South Dakota Universal Franchise League. This is a reorganization, a repurposing of the state suffrage movement. We had the Equal Suffrage Association founded in the 1889, 1890. Now we're up to 1911, let's say, and we're ready for the last push. And Mary Shields Pyle is going to be remembered for leading this last decade toward passage of women's suffrage in South Dakota and ratification of the 19th Amendment. Her husband had been involved in South Dakota politics. He served as Attorney General for Andrew Lee, the populist governor Andrew Lee. They lived in Pierre. She had 4 children. Her husband had died though in 1902, so she had raised these children on her own. And she always told the story that she saw certain group of male workers out in the railroad, and that their foreman was taking them to vote. And she felt sure the foreman was taking them and to vote and telling them how to vote. And she said to herself, if those men who are not U.S. citizens can vote, I can vote. And she said she felt it was a matter of justice. And at the time, you might think that that's interesting that she said, if those men who can vote who are not citizens can vote. South Dakota was one of 6 states to allow non-citizens to vote if they had filed their intention to become citizens. But yet not completed their full citizenship. So we were liberal with our voting laws, and you can imagine why. Because when we became a state, we were still trying to attract immigrants. We were still trying to say, come here, we will give you these privileges. There are 3 successive votes in 1914, 1916, and 1918, and they all received a lot of national attention. We think of South Dakota as being out here sort of isolated, but these national suffragists were everywhere. And in 1914, the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, she toured the state and spoke at the state fair in Huron, saying, in part, women need the vote so they can have the right to say something of the things affecting humanity. And she said, I don't care how women vote. I want them to be free. And then she kind of plays on South Dakota's heritage and says, what is the matter with South Dakota? South Dakota and all of the union should have been first to recognize justice to women. The state was once the leader in progressive thought. 25 years ago, it was advocating ideas which are recognized today as truths of the government, sort of reflecting back to that populist time. Do you women who have suffered all that a woman must in a pioneer state feel that you have earned your freedom? Don't you men think it's time to pay up? And she said, you have to pay up on election day to the men. Overall, South Dakota did not vote for women's suffrage, 42% favorable. You see, that's almost 10 more points than back in 1890. And it's better than the 38% when South Dakota voted in 1910. So we're inching along there. Pennington, if it would have been up to Rapid City and Pennington, women would have been voting in 1914. Not the case. In 1916, this is an interesting map here. It shows the percentage of counties with over 25% German heritage. Germans in the state are going to become one of the forces that women feel are anti-suffrage and working against women's suffrage. And by this time, the women are lobbying the state legislature in Pierre. They are using publishing notices in newspapers. They've got publicity campaigns, and they are working very hard in all the communities. They still fail in 1916. And you can see that these red dots, I hope you can see it, the map, but these are all the places that voted against women's suffrage in 1916. And they do correspond to highly German population areas. But one of the interesting things, I don't think we have the answer though, as to why Germans in particular opposed women's suffrage. A lot of times the women thought it was because they supported alcohol, and women also supported prohibition, giving up the drinking in the state. But the funny thing about this is in 1916, South Dakota voted in prohibition. So there were plenty of men in South Dakota to vote in prohibition without voting in women. The idea was that Germans would believe that if you gave women the vote, all of a sudden laws would become stricter and part of those laws would bring in prohibition. But here in 1916, South Dakota women's suffrage failed, but prohibition came into the state once again. Pennington voted 52.5% again, and I just thought you might like to see what some of the other counties in the area, how they voted. So you see, these are all passing the women's suffrage. And all of the states that don't have a dot on it passed, or all of the counties that don't have a red star on it, passed women's suffrage. Okay, this brings us to the 19 successful campaign. Now, both the 1916 and 1918 campaign occurred during World War I, as the country geared up to join the Great War in Europe. And this is a time when Peter Norbeck is elected a progressive Republican governor. Peter Norbeck is actually from Clay and Charles Mix County, spent part of his boyhood in Clay. He is the first South Dakota-born governor. His parents were Swedish and Norwegian, part of the immigrants to Wisconsin and then to South Dakota. And he was governor when women won the vote. And he had long been a member of the South Dakota Universal Franchise League. There are letters from Norbeck to Pyle, paying some dues. He didn't want to go on the advisory board though. And I always think, well, that's such a politician there. He doesn't want to turn anybody off by not becoming a member, but he also doesn't want to turn anybody off by being proactive on a source that could divide his voters. But in 1917, the women by this time are expert lobbyists. And so once again, and at this time, South Dakota legislature is meeting every other year. It usually meets in the odd year. So in 1917, once again, they got it placed on the ballot. And then what happened is, as the state became more and more involved in World War I, the state, started to build up a sort of anti-immigrant, like the rest of the nation's culture. And all states were putting together services to support the war, state councils of defense. So Norbeck decided to call a special session in 1918. Normally, we would not meet in 1918 during this time, but he did. And he called Pyle in his office. He said, I got an idea. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to take that women's suffrage bill and we're going to add some other voting changes to it. And he's proposing that we eliminate alien suffrage, so that if you're an immigrant male in the state and filed citizenship papers, you will no longer be able to vote unless you are a full-fledged citizen. And so he said, let's combine these things and make a citizenship of voting rights bill. And so that's what he did. And here's sort of what it looked like. Here is the text that people voted on. And just to give you a little primer here to get through some of that text. Whoops. You see, to give women the right and privilege of voting at all elections on equal terms with men. And then down here on section 3, as to persons of foreign birth, it limits the right of suffrage to those who have actually become naturalized citizens. So it combined the two issues together, making it almost impossible to vote against women's suffrage at a time when anti-immigrant kind of hysteria was at its height, when in particular Germans were singled out. And suffragists, as I said, had always sort of had this idea that Germans were holding them back. In general, Anthony, going way back to 1890, would talk about all those immigrants. Because of course we had Bohemian immigrants, we had Irish immigrants, all sorts of Germans, German Russians and continental Germans. So they always confused Stanton. And so the idea was that no man could now vote for the anti-alien bill without voting for women's suffrage. No man could vote against women's suffrage without supporting alien voting. So it put the person voting in a bind, really, if that makes sense. Here's a couple of posters. They went all out for this campaign, in part supported, you can see the patriotism of the time here. Who will take their places at the poll? These men are going to vote, going to serve in World War I. Whereas if you weren't a full citizen, you didn't have to serve. So there's an implied thing. We need our women to vote. Vote for Amendment E. Women of South Dakota ask for a voice in their own government. Pyle said this: "We are sure that this will, if possible, double the enthusiasm for suffrage workers and ensure success of our campaign. No campaign will carry on its own momentum. We must work earnestly and persistently, upheld by the knowledge that we are serving our state and our country, as well as gaining our own political freedom when we cooperate with our men to add to the vote a large body of loyal, intelligent citizens and eliminate at the same time those who are unnaturalized." So the suffragists were very for this, although they were somewhat defensive, saying this was what the governor wanted to do. This wasn't our proposal. Here's a couple of the women. You can see Mrs. Boyce was a woman from Sioux Falls, who was known to be a singer, and she would entertain during some of the lobbying sessions. And her husband was a lawyer. I think there's still a Boyce law firm in Sioux Falls. And where it's Mamie Pyle there is in the middle. That's the leader of the suffrage movement. And here they are, in South Dakota lobbying for suffrage. And then this is Mabel Ruman. Maybe some of you have heard of Mabel Ruman. She was from Deadwood. She was very active promoting suffrage in these last campaigns in the Black Hills. And she was in charge of finances for the group. Here's another picture that I love from South Dakota. Suffragists did parades, they did flyers, they spoke like I'm speaking to you, and they would go to the state fair, and they would go anywhere where people would listen to them. They'd host special dinners. But here you see it's a parade float, and the young people have banners on of countries that already allow women to vote. So you see Canada there, you see Norway, New Zealand, Yucatan. They had both positive and, you might say, so reinforcing patriotism and democracy. At the same time, sometimes they came across as being a little bit anti-immigrant, kind of 100% Americanism. Here's one of the most posters, which it's easiest to see that sentiment. You see, vote because the alien is a menace in the time of war. Amendment provides for an electorate of men and women who are 100% American. This is an opportunity for the voters of South Dakota to Americanize their state. So you see how this went with the times of the anti-immigrant culture. Now, this is Carrie Chapman Cat, and when South Dakota finally won, she's famous for saying, "Lord be praised that South Dakota is out of the way," because we've had so many campaigns. She was the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and had actually planned to visit South Dakota in middle October 1918, to help for that final push so that South Dakota would become a women's suffrage state. At this point, they're also lobbying the US Congress, and they felt like if they could get a victory in South Dakota and other states that were voting that year, this would help push the US Congress to vote for the 19th Amendment. And so she was all set to come and do a tour of 5 or 6 towns, but she had to cancel it. And this will resonate with you today as to why she had to cancel it. It was the flu pandemic of 1918. And she wrote to Pyle saying, of course, the influenza went from Boston westward and struck South Dakota considerably after its attack upon us here at headquarters in New York City. I am glad to say that it is abating here, but probably the time for the reduction of the scourge in South Dakota has not yet come. I am hoping and praying every minute that no influenza bugs will get over to your suffrage workers in South Dakota, and that you may keep your health and strength and courage to the last, and that your long efforts will be crowned with a glorious victory on November 5th. Of course, they did win on November 5th, but it did wreak havoc on the last weeks of the movement right before the vote. Schools were closing down. They weren't able to have some of their public speeches. There were several workers in the state that were national workers associated with the National American Women's Suffrage Association. One, Ida Stady, who spoke German and was working in the German community. One, Liba Peshikova, who was from Wisconsin, but from a Czech community. Some of these young women got very frustrated, and it's really easy to see in their correspondence that they're getting tired, they're getting frightened of the flu, and some of them pull out at the last minute, sort of bringing a panic to the South Dakota suffrage leaders. So Cat never came. Here's an ad that went into the newspaper right before the 1918 election and vote. And you see how much I don't know if you can read this, but it shows the black being German counties are all black and they didn't vote for suffrage, so they're really targeting this in the advertising for the vote. Okay, so what happens in 1918? I'll just remind you that in 1916, here's the counties that voted no. In 1918, only 6 counties voted no. So they had succeeded in getting rid of the opposition, even in heavily immigrant counties, heavily German counties. Although we do see the ones that still resist are very high percentage German background. And there's Pennington. Pennington had 72 and Fall River 82.2 up there. So a lot more support. Okay, so then you think we won the victory in 1918. Here's what Pyle had to say to Ruth Hipple, who was in Pierre and running some of their advertising. It is almost too much to have the war and suffrage end at the same time, but I'm mighty glad that war did not end too soon before the end of the campaign, so as much of our publicity stuff would have been valueless. Pyle says, I have to pinch myself to be sure that I'm here and that I can vote when the time arrives. They're so thrilled that they win. And she writes to her chairs around the counties. Each county had a chair. First things for which to be thankful for is the great battle for democracy is won, and our precious men are either to be returned to our land and homes or who have won greater renown by giving their lives that this world should be free. Then too, we as women have been extended our rights of democracy, the thing for which women are contending in all lands. And I wonder whether we do realize this blessing is now ours. The situation as to the epidemic in our state has been such that we have not been able to make plans for the future. So you can see the influenza still working on them. However, the national suffrage movement wants them to get the South Dakota legislature to immediately pass a resolution saying they support the 19th Amendment. they ask all these states that have given women the right to vote to get on board so that it pressures the US Congress to pass those amendments. And you see with this slide, when the 19th Amendment was passed by the US Congress, the representatives in May, and the Senate in June of 1919, well, South Dakota did pass a resolution in January. As I said, their legislature meets in January. So it was over by the time they did pass a resolution supporting it, but it was over by the time the US Congress got around to passing the 19th Amendment. And of course, then it had to be ratified and go out to the states to get enough 3/4 of states to ratify. And if South Dakota was going to have to wait till 1921 if it waited for the next odd year legislature. So of course, the suffragists got right on trying to figure out and request that Norbeck call yet another special session. And it's funny because she's writing Governor Norbeck, a lot of letters back and forth saying, can you call a special session? Will you do it so that we can ratify it? And then she sees him at the state fair that year, and she's looking at, like in the vegetables. And so she cornered him over the carrots and the onions and put him on the spot for supporting a special legislature so that South Dakota could be one of the 36 needed to ratify the 19th Amendment. And then she came up with the idea that the South Dakota parties would be meeting in Pierre in December that year, 1919. And they would be meeting that year, and that maybe if enough legislators paid their own way to Pierre to meet to choose candidates for the primaries in December, maybe there would be enough of the state legislature there that Norbeck could call one without having to pay for it. And that's exactly what happened. And what Pyle then did was go on and write all of the legislators saying she's now head of the League of Women Voters, because that's what happened to the suffrage organization when it finally was victorious. And she wrote to the legislators and she said this: when your constituency so freely expressed their desire to call the women into the political arena, they thereby tacitly declared that not South Dakota women alone, but all women ought to have the right of the ballot. The women of South Dakota desire that all their sisters should vote. National suffrage will come, but women the country over are praying that it may come before the next presidential primaries. And so she does get enough men to commit. Norbeck does call the special legislature. And I like this image of Pyle. It's a little bit younger. This is how I think she looked around the time of her advocacy. And then after the 19th Amendment passed, she became a Republican elector for the state. So she was going to go to visit Washington, D.C. to deliver the state's official votes for the presidency that December. So she, as a woman, she's one of the first 4 or 5 women that serve as presidential electors. And so South Dakota did meet. Wisconsin was the first. South Dakota was the 21st. By the time it came to, we could get the legislature meeting there in December. Here's kind of the order of ratification, but of our surrounding states, what they had before the 19th Amendment, and then when they ratified the 19th Amendment. And what happened was, it's interesting. We are on a very perfect day for this. 101 years ago today, December 3rd, 1919, these political men met for their primaries during the day. Then they gathered at the Capitol in Pierre, and they held a special legislature in the evening on December 3rd, probably about this time. And they read the 19th Amendment through several times. has to be, for political reasons, has to be read several times. And then they waited until after midnight on December 4th. They went back in the rooms again and for the final reading, and then they all voted unanimously to ratify the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution. So they did it over a period of December 3rd and 4th, all within a few hours, and it was unanimous. They did it at 12:40 on December 4th, so just after midnight. And then many of the legislators supposedly caught the 2 a.m. train out of Pierre to go back home. So it was quite a feat there. So they did come through, and we were the 21st state. So we counted as as a state that was needed to pass the 19th Amendment. Tennessee was, of course, a 36th state, and it came right down to a wire there. And we see poor Mississippi finally ratified it in 1984. Every time a state ratified it, this is Alice Paul at her headquarters of the National Women's Party in Washington, D.C. Every time a state ratified it, she'd sew on a star. So South Dakota is one of those stars, the 21st star on the flag. And then this is a National Certificate of Service given to Mamie Pyle for her long service. I love this. This is in her scrapbook, and she's got all her delegate badges. She looks like she was in St. Louis in 1919, in Washington in 16 and 17. And there it's signed down here, you see, by Carrie Chapman Cat for all the work that she had done in the campaign. And then, as I said, the state suffrage leaders became active in League of Women Voters. And one of the things I find interesting, I said that Mamie Pyle was an elector. She ran in the 1920 election under the Republican Party to be an elector. And then also there was a woman from Mitchell, Myra Weller, who ran under the Nonpartisan League Party in the state at the time. And there was a woman who ran also from Mitchell, Mrs. Lewis, for a Democratic elector. And so women immediately started participating in politics, and they all went their own way. They went together because they all wanted to vote. It didn't mean that they agreed on every political issue. So I always think that's sort of telling how immediately they began to use their vote in a variety of ways. And so I'm going to end my share there and maybe answer some questions, hear some comments on any of that. And I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit about South Dakota suffrage.
Well, thank you, Molly. And here we thought that we should have done this program months ago. We picked the right day on the nose. I was
wondering if you knew that.
I didn't know that. I wish I did. I'll admit it here to everybody who's listening. It
was a perfect day.
I was angling for August to try to get the 19th Amendment in there, and it was so wacky at that time that we just couldn't hit that. But I am glad that we did this here tonight on this day. I have a question. I'm sort of familiar with Mamie Pyle, but there's a lot there. Isn't there some like a historic home or something in the state that's also set aside, or more about her?
Yes. Mamie Pyle lived in Huron, and she had a home there, and it is a house museum right now. And I think if you visit there in Huron,
I guess that's what
it's a part of their museum system. And in fact, I was supposed to speak in Huron on August 16th, but that presentation was canceled because of COVID. And so she worked there, and I think her daughter got the flu when she was doing all this. And all the national leaders made a trek to Huron to visit with her. Then they'd go to Pierre, and there was a lot of exchange back and forth between Pierre and Huron with the suffragists.
And again, the irony here of that 2 weeks ago we did the 1918 Spanish flu, and then now we have this. So I guess we're really in a right period piece here for these conversations. Molly, do you have any comments as far as what with the women's suffrage movement? The efforts that they made, did they impact further civil rights reforms? Some of the campaigning strategies and things did that help move some of the other movements along here in our country?
Well, they did, but they did in diverse ways, depending on their own political, aspirations. And of course, in some ways, we're still benefiting from what these suffragists did in terms of pioneering. They were very pioneering in their strategies, street corner speaking, lobbying the legislature, petitions. Women actually formed a lot of the strategies that we use regularly in politics. And, they continued to work for laws that injured women, property laws, divorce laws. Many states in South Dakota did not let states or let women serve on juries until 1947, I think, because it was deemed too much for them, right? So there was a lot to work on. And I think a lot of these suffragists were also active in the labor movement, working for better working conditions because they were trying to protect children. We still had a lot of child labor then. They were trying to protect workers so that women had enough money for their families. So they got active, particularly, I think, in the labor movement, and then still working on many laws for women.
It's almost, well, it's so, it doesn't seem like it's that long ago. It seems so interesting how difficult it was for us to get to this point. And then again, we've seen a lot of conversation this year again about how diversity and in treating people equally, and it feels like we've come a long ways, and then yet maybe there's still a lot of lessons here to be learned. I mean, any comments in that regard?
Well, yeah, this is just a start, right?
Right.
There was always a tension between, first of all, African American women in the suffrage movement being asked to take a second seat or, march in the back of the parade. They resisted, and they got in front in marching various suffrage parades. Sometimes they worked together, but African American women were very aware that when they worked for suffrage, they had to do it with particular strategies themselves. And there was a lot of racism. And then, as I hinted at it, there was a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment. And, those women are too backward. Those German women, they don't care. They are drudges. Then, of course, in South Dakota, Native Americans and Native American women in general were not allowed to vote until there was a Civil Rights Act of 1924. So this did not include all women. Many women were subject to Jim Crow laws in the South, just like their male counterparts, until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So this is a process that it started it started with Abigail Adams, in sending letters to her husband, while they were writing the Constitution, saying, "Don't forget the ladies. They need to have some, representation in your government," right? And it's a long process, but there are many, many women left out. And one of the problematic things that suffragists do is they kind of fall into this trap, I would call it, of educated suffrage. They start to make the argument that you need to be educated in order to vote, because they would be so frustrated by immigrants who didn't know the language voting, or people that they viewed. The suffragists themselves were often anti-immigrant, or they didn't think that Native American men should vote. My own piece on in the equality at the ballot box, I studied the 1890 referendum, that vote on women's suffrage, along with a vote that was attempting to restrict Native American male voting, which is interesting because the one vote was to grant women the vote. The other one was just restrict Native voting. Our Constitution said nothing about whether Native men could vote or not. And people, because of various other laws at the time reshaping Native citizenship or attempting to, many in the state legislature, many men thought that Native men were going to be able to vote as soon as they got an allotment of land. And I hate to say it, but they reacted very much like the Jim Crow culture of their day. And they passed this referendum that purported to restrict voting. Now, it failed too, which then infuriated the suffragists because it seemed like they didn't pass women's suffrage, but they didn't restrict Native suffrage. Of course, neither one were allowed to vote, through subsequent actions. But there was a lot of, many people, the rights of many people were being restricted. And sometimes in fighting for their own rights, they would brush up against, and they didn't always act like we wish they would have. It was a process for them. Some of them changed over time. And you did have some Native women working with the suffragists, those that were part of mixed race Métis communities. We have documented some of them. So, but it's a long process. I mean, in many ways, we're still working on it today.
Yeah, we are. And, I think it was interesting you commented about how Peter Norbeck was a perfect politician, but yet I think he helped craft exactly the perfect way to get the vote in. When I learned a little bit more about Amendment E that you described there, Molly, I think maybe perhaps he really came to the front there as a leader and helped craft the perfect amendment.
Well, right. But, and as a woman, you tell this story and you get to the end and you're like, you want to have this great victory, but then you realize you took some rights away from people to get your own. And I think you're probably right. I mean, Norbeck was a politician, right? He was manipulating things, and maybe he was for the women. I think he was a genuine. Lydia, his wife, immediately wrote Pyle and said, thanks for all the work you've done. I'm so excited. But then you're left with this idea. Did women in South Dakota win the vote because the electorate wanted them to vote, or was this because they wanted to take away the vote from aliens, right? And you don't know. You want to say it's because they supported women.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I learned tonight is that it wasn't just a clear vote for women to vote, which again, to me today, as we sit here in 2020, it's just hard for me to imagine that we struggled so much to get to that point, to provide that equality there that was being, that everyone was striving for in the movement. It's hard for me to imagine all those things. Perhaps 100 years from now, there'll be people sitting on another program going, wow, I can't believe they struggled with these issues in 2020 like they did. And to your point, Molly, it's processes of conversation, I guess. And so, again, I think this is the value of understanding our history and what does that mean in terms of how does that translate into today. And I hope for our viewers that are watching that we're able to illustrate some of those things today. Is there any other things that you'd like to comment on, Molly? I don't have any other questions in the queue. I appreciate the folks that are there, but anything else you'd like to add, Molly?
No, I just think, it's a good lesson to keep connected to politics and, keep working for things. I mean, if you think about it, starting with that Declaration of Sentiments, asking for the vote, but also asking to be admitted to college, asking for access to the professions, all of those things, we should not take for granted. And many of us are doing things because of these women. Right? Because of all the work they did. I can be a female history professor, right? And that, has not been that long. I mean, you had to get to the second women's movement before they put quotas off, and only 5% women could be in law school, right? So it took a long, long time. But these women helped pave the way, and they worked for so long. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton did not live to see women vote. They died 1902, 1906. They, you just think, worked for a long time. And then the last thing I'll say is I also find it interesting. South Dakota had discussions about women's suffrage from its early territorial period until 1920. It was always a part of our debates. The women always seemed to get it on the ballot every few years. It was, they got it on the ballot every few years, so they had enough support for that, but they just couldn't tip it over to actually win. So anyway, thanks so much for inviting me. Sometime I'd love to visit in person and get to know your museum and the people who visit it regularly. That's always a good time for me to do. And I like to get out and meet people and tell them about USD and what I do with students there. So.
Well, thank you, everyone. Dr. Molly Rozum, University of South Dakota. And her book, Equality at the Ballot Box, Votes for Women on the Northern Great Plains. It's available. It'll be a great read for you this winter as we stay safe and inside. Thank you all for joining us. And again, once this video is created and posted, we'll send out an e-blast, and feel free to share it. And know that you can go to journeymuseum.org. Please, I think it's important for us to continue to tell these stories. We can't forget where we've come from, especially we are in process all the time, as Dr. Rozum.
Yep.
So thank you, everyone. We're going to sign off tonight, and we appreciate everyone who has been in attendance. And we'll see you in 2 weeks, we hope. Good night.
Thanks.